Hi, everyone, and welcome to Night School. I'm Lynn from the Nightlife programming team at Cal Academy. While we're away from Claude and the Penguins, we're thrilled to be bringing nightlife programming to you every week with virtual nightlife and night school. Thanks to everyone for tuning in tonight and everyone who's tuned in the past few months. We're so grateful that you choose to spend your Thursday nights with us. Tonight, you'll be getting a very special behind-the-scenes look at the Academy's latest Planetarium show from some of the creators themselves.
Before we introduce those creators who are all around us right now, I'm Christina, the producer behind the scenes usually. Thanks again for being here. Tonight's program is live, and so we welcome your questions and comments, jokes. We have a team of penguins here to help pass along your questions. So please ask some so the penguins can feel useful. And now I'm going to hand it over to our guests, and we're going to disappear from the screen. So Ken, say hello and introduce yourself.
All right. Thanks, Christina. Hi, everybody. My name's Ken Ackermann. I'm an animator and technical director in the visualization studio at the California Academy of Sciences. And on this show in particular, I was in charge of animating most of the animals in the show. So that's a bit about what I'm going to discuss tonight. Yasmeen?
Hey everyone, my name is Yasmeen Smalley-Norman. I'm an environmental communicator and 3D modeler, and I'm super excited to talk to y'all about how I made some of the 3D models of coral that you will see in the show.
Hello everyone, my name is Mike Schmitt. I was the visual effects supervisor for this show, and I'm also a visual effects artist. And I'll be taking you through some of the layout and lighting and coral modeling as well. So before we start talking, and we'll probably talk for about 45 minutes or so and answer questions while we talk, we'd like to show you the opening scene of Expedition Reef. And it's about 4 minutes long, so why don't you just kick back and relax, and then we'll see you in a few minutes. All right.
See you in a bit.
Coral reefs color our world. Their beauty captivates us. Their diversity astounds us. We build aquariums to house these treasures, but their greatest value lies in the natural world. Here, near Devil's Point in the Philippines, we are immersed in one of Earth's most diverse ecosystems. A system that harnesses the power of the sun through a unique collaboration between animals and algae. A system that supports thousands of species by making efficient use of often scarce nutrients. Hidden in these nooks and crannies, we find a multitude of organisms in a complex web of connections. A moray eel gets a little help from its friends, a dental exam from cleaner shrimp and cleaner wrasse fish. They eat small parasites that can make the eel sick. A win-win mutualistic relationship. Not all interactions turn out so well. A crown-of-thorn starfish devours coral, leaving bare white skeletons in its wake. A tiny trapezia crab successfully defends its coral home from the much bigger creature. And a brightly colored nudibranch dines on sponges growing on the reef. Its colors warn predators to stay away. Chemicals ingested by the nudibranch make it poisonous. We observe these species and many more, but what we can't see are all the relationships that link them to one another. Most importantly, they take part in a food web, overlapping connections of producers and consumers, predators and prey. Humans take part in this food web too. And coral reefs support more complex food webs than any other places on the planet. What makes these places special? We'll depart from the Philippines to explore where we find reefs around the globe.
Wow.
Cool.
Pretty cool stuff.
So to start off, since we're all watching this on our flat screens at home instead of in the planetarium where we wish we were, I thought it'd be cool to take you on a little trip through Morrison Planetarium and show you how it works. So if you haven't been there, Morrison Planetarium is here under the yellow arrow, under the eastern hump in our beautiful living roof at the California Academy of Sciences in Golden Gate Park. And this is what it looks like from the inside of the building, and we often refer to it as the dome. And this is what it looks like inside with a crowd.
Giant moray.
Yeah. Expedition Reef came out in spring of 2018. And this is an image of it on our large 75-foot screen. The dome, unlike a planetarium in other planetariums around the world, is tilted 30 degrees. So it's like an IMAX screen. And the audience is facing forward. So like an IMAX screen, it's in front of you. However, this one is a hemisphere. And so it surrounds you. And so when you're sitting in your seat, if the image fills your peripheral vision, and there are speakers scattered throughout the screen, so you're surrounded by audio too, so you can hear the beautiful sound design by our sound designer Chris Hedge, and the music as well that Mike Jennings, our composer, creates for us. Using YouTube 360, I'm able to actually pan around inside the theater and give you a sense of the screen relative to the seats. So what we showed you at the beginning was actually just a subset of this whole image that we're creating. So I can pan around here and you can see. So this is the front of the theater. Off to the side. And then behind you. Pretty cool. It's an amazing space.
It makes me miss it, actually, because we haven't been there in several months. And we usually go into the dome every single day to watch our shots. So
yeah. And working with this hemispherical image is quite a challenge. And the way we do it is with a format called the full dome format. It's a standard that planetariums use around the world, and it allows us to share our content with other planetariums and also license our shows. Our shows are licensed in many countries and in many different languages around the world. And what this image is, it's actually a fisheye image. And it's from left to right, it's a 180-degree field of view. And also from top to bottom. And since our dome is tilted, down here where I'm pointing, you can see that, right around here is the front of the theater. And then up at the top is behind you. And this is to your left, and this is to your right. Yeah. And the way our planetarium works, the way we project this hemispherical image onto our dome is by breaking it into 6 pieces amongst 6 projectors. And all the 6 projectors are synchronized. And then the images they project overlap and warp in order to create the illusion of a seamless image. And here's actual footage of us sitting in the dome, looking over Yasmeen's shoulder. And you can see a couple of the projectors along the edge. And what's cool about the planetarium is that our office is actually underneath it. And in the evening when we're done with our work, and we can submit it to our render farm. And then in the morning, we have an automated system that brings the imagery up onto our editorial suite upstairs, and we're able to watch our shots in the morning and critique them together and then improve them over time. And what we're watching here is actually a test of a scene that we did in the Caribbean of an elkhorn coral. So planetarium film, yeah, go ahead.
Should I mimic the pose that I was doing?
Sideways.
And by the way, somebody asked if there was a best seat in the theater, and there definitely is. What is it? F16 is where our sound designer sits when he sits in the dome and does the mix. So for the audio, that's definitely the best seat, and it's probably the best seat for the picture too.
Yeah. Yeah, if you sit on the side, it's kind of hard to watch. It gets really distorted. So planetarium filmmaking is sort of a unique beast. I like to think of it as a cross between an amusement park ride, a nature documentary, and also a science visualization, where most of the emphasis is on the science visualization, but it's also fun to watch, and it's also a serious story that we're telling. And underneath all of this is data. We're doing a ton of data visualization. The data is the scaffolding underneath the entire, on which we build the show. And the story ties it all together. This is an image of a science advisor meeting that we have at the beginning, and in the front is Ryan Wyatt, our director. Sorry, this image is a little blurry, but he is the person who writes our script, and we're all over sitting here on the right, and the science advisors are on the left. We rely on the science advisors from the very beginning to help us craft the show and to critique our visuals and make sure everything is accurate. Ken, did you want to mention something about this?
Oh, just that the advisor meeting is one of my favorite parts of the process, because we get all these brilliant scientists together in one room and we kind of pitch the show to them, and they're all experts around the topics that we're covering. And so they all have a lot of really interesting things to say. Sometimes they have very strong disagreements with each other, and it ends up being just an incredibly interesting day, and it's really fun.
Yeah. And another amazing thing that they do is that they introduce us to their friends and collaborators around the world. So while we're designing the show, we meet all these incredible scientists and artists and photographers and daredevils that are doing incredible science, and we get to learn about what they're doing, and then they provide us with incredible data sets as well that we can then incorporate into our show. And this is a sample of some of the groups that we work with on the show. Yeah, and we'll refer back to them later on as we start showing you some other things. Early on in the show, we were lucky that the Steinhardt Aquarium is right outside the door of our office, and we chose the Philippine Steinhardt exhibit as the main inspiration for the design of our show. It's an incredible aquarium. I love watching it. Here's Ken checking out the fish. We spent hours and hours watching what happens there. And what's so amazing about it is the creatures that live there come from a specific place in the Philippines where our researchers have been going for decades. It's called Devil's Point. It's located on the southwestern tip of Maracaiban Island, a couple of hours south of Manila, and it's located on the Verde Island Passage right here. This is Devil's Point, and this is Devil's Rock. And the area in between here is where they do most of their diving. And apparently it's one of the most biodiverse coral reefs in the world. And this is what it looks like underwater. We spent a lot of time combing through hours and hours of video and photographs that our advisors provided us. And one of the big technical challenges for us to figure out was how we were going to represent the richness of this coral reef using computer graphics, because we made a decision early on that we would use computer graphics instead of filming it.
And speaking of computer graphics, we're getting some pretty good questions coming in.
Sure.
Hannah is asking, how long did it take you to render the whole film? And then related, Serena's asking, who's responsible for the render farm, and is there a dedicated software team at the Academy?
And before that, somebody asked about the opening scene, whether or not that was all animation, and it is. The shot in the Steinhardt where you see the person looking at the tank, just the people, that's the only video footage that we have in the show. Everything else is computer generated. But to the question about how long it took to render is kind of a tricky one, because we spent a couple of years working on the show, at least a full year in production, maybe even more than that. And during that time, we're splitting it up, and so I can't really tell you how long the whole thing took to render, but there were certain shots that took a lot longer than others. Mike, do you remember some of those longer ones, how long they took?
It's been too many years to remember, but I do recall that the opening scene that you saw, the final frames took, up to maybe 20 hours a frame.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but it was rendered in this incredible software called Clarice that was introduced to us through our friends at Tippett Studio over in the East Bay. And visual effects companies use it to do some very complex rendering. And it was something that we learned to use for this show. Yeah. Shall we move on? Or there was another question?
The other question was about the team that supports the render farm. And we do have an engineering team that supports our render farm and our computers, and we definitely could not do what we do without them. They're awesome.
And our engineers also run our planetarium, take care of the projectors, work with our real-time software. I mean, there's a lot of pieces that hold all of this together. We have a small team of artists, but we also have a small team of engineers, and we all work together, which is really fun and a lot of work. So one of the first things that we start on these projects is by building terrain, sort of doing digital location scouting, kind of like you do on Google Earth. But we built a tool in our 3D software, Houdini, which is sort of the main software that we use. We call it the Globe tool, and it allows us to accurately place three-dimensional, or create a three-dimensional model using geographic data, satellite imagery, digital elevation maps, bathymetry, that type of thing. And so here is a really quick demo of how we built a three-dimensional model of Devil's Point using mostly open source imagery from NASA, NOAA, and other places like that. And this is sort of the first step of building that place using computer graphics. This is a coarse 3D model of Devil's Point with the water removed, so you can see the seafloor. And it's pretty cool to see there's this low depression between the point and the rock, and then it just drops off here. And the area where the scene takes place is right here in this low depression, which is, I think, about 10 meters deep maximum. And then where it drops off here is actually the Twilight Zone. I don't know if you've been to our Twilight Zone exhibit, but this is where some of our daredevil divers go to look at other corals that are living down at 300 to 500 feet below sea level, which is incredible. But at this point, I'd like to now let Yasmeen talk about some of the details that she created that we started to add to the scene, because this scene right here is still too low resolution for a final. Yasmeen?
Yeah, I'm super excited to talk about kind of the granular, how I created 3D models of corals, some of which you see in the show. So you can go to the next slide, Mike. So I was in the Philippines for about 10 months doing Fulbright research, and my project was to photograph and then create 3D models of specifically endangered and vulnerable coral species. So the ones that we are at risk of losing, if not sadly have already lost due to stressors like climate change and overfishing and sedimentation. And I spent around 10 months there, and that meant I got to travel around the country and do a lot of diving and underwater photography to turn this next photo. Go to the next slide, Mike. So this is a single image of Lobophilia serratus, which is one of 10 endangered coral species in the Philippines. And I wanted to turn just a single image like this into, next slide, please, what you see here, which is a 3D model. And this is just a screen recording of me rotating the 3D model so you can see it from different angles. And to do this, I used a process called photogrammetry, which I'll explain in a little bit. But essentially, it lets you take a series of photos of a single object and turn it into a virtual digital 3D model. And what you see there kind of in the corner, that PVC pipe serves two purposes. One is like a known object, so I can measure it in real time and then use it in the software to measure how big the coral is or whatever your subject is. And then also has those pink paint splotches, and that's to help the software identify the same thing in a series of photos. So I'll get into the methodology a little bit, but first I want to talk about why I was in the Philippines in the first place. And I chose the Philippines as the subject of my research because there are, I believe, over 600 species of corals in the Philippines. It's an incredibly biodiverse place for marine life. And it's not alone. It's in a geographic area called the Coral Triangle, and that includes the countries that you see there. So incredible high biodiversity, which is why there's over 600 coral species. Now, my previous 3D modeling work had been in places like the Caribbean, where there's only 60, give or take, species of corals. So this was quite a big and really awesome adjustment for me professionally. So if we want to go to the next slide. But it definitely took a village. This is not research that I conducted single-handedly by any means. Just like when you're scuba diving, you need a buddy. And when you're producing this kind of work, you need a team. So this is a team of scientists, scuba divers, researchers at De La Salle University. And I partnered with Dr. Al Laquanen and his research team to get out to some remote locations in the Philippines and go diving with them. And while I was there, they were actually working on the 3-year assessment of coral reef health in the Philippines. And I believe this scale and type of assessment hadn't been done since the 80s. So they were trying to, paint a really complete picture of what coral reef health in the Philippines look like. Go to the next slide, please. So of the 600 plus corals in the Philippines, I was looking at, or I wanted to photograph and create 3D models of the ones that were endangered and vulnerable. And that's actually a designation created by the IUCN. But in order to, know which ones those were beyond just their scientific names in a list, I had to first be able to identify them. So I started doing taxonomic training to be able to tell one coral apart from another while underwater. And it's a little tricky, but a really great way to do that is actually by studying what you see here. And this is a collection of coral skeletons, actually, that were at the University of the Philippines. And you can, get a coral underneath a microscope and study it and learn all of the other things that distinguish one coral species from another. So I did, this research. Yeah, I mean, it's so helpful because otherwise you're underwater and you're like, eh?
Yeah,
I remember
overwhelming.
Yeah, when we first started learning about corals, it was hard enough above water to learn what they were and memorize their name. They're so beautiful.
Totally. Yeah, and unfortunately, you can't use things like color or shape to identify to a species level because based on wave action or currents, that can change the morphology or the shape of a coral, and the color, gosh, can be you can have all kinds of different colors for a coral of the same species, just depending on, where it is on a reef. So yeah, can't use those easy indicators, unfortunately. All right, so if we go to the next slide. Oh, I actually see a good question from David. Only stony corals, no soft corals. Yes, that's a really good question. So the process of photogrammetry, which I'll explain later, is based on a set or a series of photos of the same object. But the key thing is you can't have that object moving while you're taking the photograph, because then the software can't piece together one photo from the next. So soft corals like gorgonians or sea fans, the ones that are kind of swaying in the current, the software won't be able to recognize. Yeah, then you get just like a blurry mess, unfortunately. So I was based in Manila, which you can kind of see there in the near the center top-ish. But it was a great place to be based during my time in the Philippines because I was able to both rent a van and go to Lian and Mabini, which are 3 hours without traffic. So in Manila, it's more like 5 hours. But I was able to get to coral reefs and get to some scuba diving locations pretty quickly, or fly out to some other areas around the country. If you go to the next slide. And I averaged about one trip a month, and these trips usually lasted about a week or so. And that left a lot of time, which I needed for the processing of the 3D models. And if anyone has lived in Manila, you may know that if you're doing anything involving Wi-Fi, buckle in, get prepared to wait. And that's how the software that I was using worked. So a lot of uploading photos, a lot of highlighting in my list, crossing off different species, and then also creating what you see here, which is an underwater field guide that I laminated so I could clip it onto my BCD, my scuba gear.
Nice.
And yeah, my dive buddy and I could at least have a photo and be like, this,
Yeah,
that.
good idea.
Do you still have these?
Yeah, somewhere. Yeah. Usually the answer was like, that could be it. You might as well just photograph it anyway.
Yeah.
You get a lot of duplicates and stuff doing that. All right, so if we go to the next slide. All right, so now y'all kind of understand the process or the methodology behind getting out to these locations, finding the right coral, or a coral that you think is the right coral. But let's talk about the process of creating a 3D model. And it's one that I mentioned is called photogrammetry. And essentially what it allows you to do is take a series of photos and turn it into a 3D model at its most simple. And there are some constraints, like we talked about. Your object can't move. So sorry in advance for anyone who's planning on 3D modeling their pet, unless your pet is a turtle or a rock. You might not be too lucky. But it's a really cool process, and you can do it with an iPhone. You don't have to have a fancy rig or anything like that. All right, next slide. So here's a short video clip of me diving and taking the photos needed for a model. And you see I'm, it's called in the photography world chimping, like I'm like a chimp looking at something. I'm looking at the photo and then I'm taking another one. And I took a photo every 3 seconds or so, and then I would move to the next little area. And someone asked a good question: how long does it take to make a 3D model? And that really depends on a couple things. It depends on mostly the size of the object that you're photographing, how big it is. So if you go to the next slide, I'll explain. So the reason that it really depends on the size is because you need to get enough overlap from one image to another for the software to be able to recognize the same angle of the coral or of the object or whatever and stitch it together. That's how it works. So you need to have. So is that
what we're seeing here is the series of photos you took?
Yeah, and this is a GIF that I created. I think this is only 35 images in the GIF. But most of the models took around 100 photos to stitch together successfully. Now there were some really small models I made that were like the size of a golf ball, only needed 45, 50 photos. But then there are much bigger ones that are the size of a desk that needed, upwards of 250. All right, next slide. And here's kind of an example of the other factor to think about, which is not just size, but it's also about complexity. So this is a Porites coral, and it's got all those cute little stubby fingers. But that means that there's a lot of nooks and crannies, and you have to make sure that your lighting is on point so that you're illuminating each of those little areas. Because what happens if you don't get enough coverage, either in a really complex or in a really large area, is you end up where the software thinks that this area is like this area and will stitch together the wrong thing, or you'll just have gray blank space where the software won't render anything at all. So it's a very time-consuming, patient process. And of course, on top of this, you have to be making sure that your buoyancy is on point. You're not knocking into your dive buddy or the corals that you're photographing. You have to make sure that you're not running out of air. You have to keep an eye on your gauge. So there's a lot of things involved, and I know us photographers tend to get really into the scene, but a couple
of those
cases.
Yeah, this is a beautiful model. I was going to say it's probably one of those cases where if you have garbage coming in, you're going to get garbage out, right? So you need really good photographs to get a good model.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was using a.
Oops, sorry, I already went ahead.
Oh, no worries. We can keep talking. I was using a Canon 7D in Aquatica housing, which is the housing for regular topside cameras that allows you to bring it underwater. And I was using 2 strobes on either side of my camera, as you probably saw in that video, to make sure that each scene was lit perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a larger coral. This is a Turbinaria species.
It's beautiful.
And this one, I think, yeah, they're my favorite with all the waves.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a question: do you capture multiple exposures?
Oh, sometimes I do. So I'm guessing this means, like, do you take a series of photos more than once of the same object?
Like bracketing.
I guess that's kind of tough underwater, though.
Oh, like exposure bracketing. Oh, so that's a good question.
Yeah.
I don't, but here's what I do to make sure that I get the exposure right. Is before I got to a new coral, like any number of things could have changed even in the span of 5 minutes. That if we were shallow, the sun could have been hidden by clouds, or if I knocked one of the dials on my strobes, that could have changed things. Or if one of my strobes died, I didn't charge the batteries long enough. So before taking each series of photos and finding a new coral to photograph, I would take a couple photos, chimp again, look at the back of the camera, make sure that the exposure looked good, check my histogram to make sure that the data was there. And then when I was finally ready, I would take a photo of my fingers to indicate, okay, this is the start of the series. And then when I was done,
slate.
Yeah, you can use your slate, yeah. And then I would do the same thing when I was done to be like, all right, this is the end. And then when I was, going through and combing through all the photos later, I knew exactly where the stop and start was.
Cool.
And someone asked, have you done any models of bleached or diseased corals? Not diseased, but yeah, I've modeled a few bleached ones, and it's kind of sad. And it's also actually harder for the computer or for the software to distinguish like one area of the coral from the next, because it's all the same, it's all bleached white. So challenging and sad at the same time. So this is a pretty cool turntable of some of the models that I produced that are in Expedition Reef. So the next time you're able to see the show, keep your eyes peeled for some of these. And all told, I think I created around 150 models of corals while in the Philippines. So I didn't, thanks. So I definitely didn't reach my target of photographing all of the endangered or even all of the vulnerable corals on my list. I think out of the 10 endangered species, I only found 3. And then of the 160 or so vulnerable, I think I got around 50 or so. And there's duplicates, and sometimes you're just not lucky. You don't find it in the field. And you're wondering, in terms of trying to find some of these corals, sometimes all you're working with is someone saying, oh yeah, I saw that coral 20 years ago on an expedition. So you go there and you try to find it. Sometimes it's not there anymore.
Here's a question from Dwayne. Are the models available for 3D printing?
I had some of them on Sketchfab, which is the site that you use to host 3D models. They're not there anymore because Sketchfab moved to a pay-to-play model, but they're still available. You can definitely reach out.
And we printed one in the Viz Studio, and we printed an elkhorn coral. I don't know if it was one of your models, but it came out pretty cool. It was about this big.
It's a separate model. It's not Yasmeen's model, and I'll show it a little bit later, or it'll be in a scene. It's in the Caribbean, and it's on our Sketchfab page, and you can download it. So we'll put that in the comments. Or I think it's on there somewhere, or there are a bunch on there to download. Not as nice as Yasmeen's, though. Her models are beautiful.
Yeah.
Thanks. Oh, one thing I forgot to actually show is how the methodology of creating the series of photos. And I'll demonstrate briefly on my water bottle. the way that I made sure that I got enough coverage from one photo from the next was if this water bottle is a coral, I started at the base and worked in a spiral pattern. So just photographing all around the base, making a pass up, doing a couple passes of the middle, and then finally wrapping up and photographing on top so that you make sure you're not missing any of the detail.
Cool.
All right. Next slide. And, you know, as I mentioned before, it would not have been possible whatsoever without the help of the scientists that I worked with. You see on the right, this is us at our field station, or the university's field station in Mabini, or Leon, which is not too far away, a few hours. And it was really cool also because I got to meet some of the Academy scientists while on an expedition in Ramblon. So we're there on the left. And I got to hear all about really cool nudibranchs and all kinds of research that the Academy's doing. So as much as I love corals, I think the people were the coolest part.
Yeah.
Yeah, some of the other advisors that we worked very closely with are in that photo on the left there.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks, Yasmeen.
Yeah, you bet.
I'll have to say, while we were working on this show, at the beginning, we had no idea what we were doing. And we discovered Yasmeen as we were doing research on 3D corals, and she had some of the best 3D models that I'd seen done so far. And this was back in 2016, 2017, I think. Yeah. And so we learned a lot from her, and we started experimenting ourselves. We started at the Academy. This photo here is of Charles Delbeek from the Steinhardt Aquarium. And early on, he volunteered to get into the Philippine tank and do some tests for us with just a little point and shoot Olympus Tough camera. And he photographed a few individual coral specimens to help us test the software to see if we could actually build an accurate 3D model of a coral underwater. And it was a successful test, but we wanted to scan the entire reef. And so next, Luis Rocha took it to the next step, and he's normally diving down to the twilight zone to 300, 500 feet below sea level, but he volunteered to get into the tank for us and photograph the entire reef. And he used his high-end Nikon DSLR with a very wide lens with two strobes, just like what Yasmeen was using. You can see here he has incredible control over his buoyancy, but he's basically just swimming a lawnmower pattern over the reef. And Yasmeen, you volunteer here, right? And swim there? Yeah.
Yeah. So usually I'm at the Academy once a month volunteering and giving the Coral Reef Dive Show. And I can tell you, it looks like it's a really big exhibit, and it is, but you don't have much room to maneuver back there at all. So what he's doing is really
it's pretty tight spot.
Mm-hmm.
So then I took he took almost 1,000 photographs, and then this is the solution, the software. It's called Agisoft Photoscan. It's now called Metashape, but this is the 3D digital point cloud that it output for me after some work manipulating the photos. So you see it's three-dimensional, and the photogrammetry gives us the three-dimensional location of the surface of the object relative to the position of all the cameras, and also the color. And then from that, we can create a 3D model that we can then bring. This is the grayscale model of that, brought into our rendering software Blender using the Cycles render, and then we can light it with the sun. And it starts to look like the real thing. It's pretty amazing. And then we took that reef, that model, and integrated it into a CAD model of the Steinhardt Aquarium architecture. And then our artist, Donovan Brutus, took this scene and then turned it into the beautiful scene that you saw at the beginning and made it look real. It was easier than shooting it with a camera because it gave us control, a real camera. It gave us control over the exact camera move so that we could cross dissolve to the scene in the Philippines. In addition, we needed to add detail to this scene, not just using Yasmeen's coral, but we needed more. We needed the coastline. We wanted to detail out the rock. We wanted to detail out the seafloor. And we found this wonderful survey company in Manila called PhilSurv Geodetic Services, and this is them on their bunker boat, and they went out to the location for 3 or 4 days, maybe even more, and brought their drone with them, and they photographed the island for us. So here's similar to what Yasmeen showed us in her photographs, this is the drone's point of view of the island. And again, the drone is programmed to swim or fly sort of a a lawnmower pattern with a lot of overlap between the photos. And then what we can do is plug that into the Magic PhotoScan software to get a more defined three-dimensional model of the coastline, which is much better than what we were able to get from the satellite data. And FilServe also, they were good free divers, so they were able to go down for several minutes at a time with a GoPro camera strapped to their head, and they swam around individual reef sections at Devil's Point to sort of allow us to build 3D models of the larger macro scale of the reefs. And then from this underwater, it's just GoPro footage, we were able to create some 3D models like this, which I'm calling coral reef patches, and we built about 15 to 20 of these from GoPro footage. And then this is what we plant all of the individual corals that Yasmeen gave us, and additional corals that we made ourselves. Finally, all of this comes together in our, I did all the layout in this open source 3D software called Blender. Here's Devil's Point and the rock from above. We're tilting down, remove the water. And then you can see all of those coral reef patches. I just sort of artistically distributed them on that seafloor that was created from the GIS data. And then placed the Steinhardt right around here, and then designed a camera move that followed through that reef and then towards sort of the action right here where the eel is, like right around here, and swims away and then up through the top of the rock. And then what you see down here, oops, is the soundtrack, which is Ryan's script that he's writing while we're developing the visuals. And in Blender, which is great, it has a video sequencer. It allows me to edit the audio and move it in time while I'm animating the camera. And this is what this is sped up, but this is what the grayscale version of that camera move looks like before we add any of the additional detail to it. So this allows us to pace the shot, figure out where the action is going to take place before Ken starts doing his magic with the animation, and before our TD map Blackwell starts putting the corals in there and rendering them. So that's what the nudibranch looked like early on.
Not as threatening without its color.
In the next scene we're going to show you too, we also wanted to get up close to a coral and really see what they look like, because you really don't understand a coral until you get up close and see the polyps and see the colony of polyps, and also what lives inside the polyps. So Jerome Lepre and Shauna Lacoste went back to these our coral reef holding tanks in the back behind Steinhardt Aquarium, where they're growing corals, and we were able to photograph cropper corals in there with a GoPro camera with a custom macro lens on it that Jerome sort of wired up so that he could control it with Wi-Fi underwater. And then he also used Olympus Tough to take some close-up macro photographs as well. So this gives you an idea of what those polyps actually look like. It's pretty amazing. It's so different than what you see from far away. Mm-hmm. And then we also sampled some of the tissue from this cropper coral, and Gary Williams, one of the biologists at the Academy, took it and put it under the microscope to show us what the zooxanthellae look like, which are here in this lower right corner. Those are the algae that live inside the polyps, and they live a symbiotic relationship with the polyps. The polyps provide the zooxanthellae shelter, and then the zooxanthellae feed the polyps through photosynthesis. Which I didn't know a zooxanthellae from my elbow when I first started on the show, and now I know it a little bit. We also sourced 3D models from researchers. This is the table coral that you saw in the shot in the opening sequence, and this is from Rebecca Albright's research in Pompeii. And this is a 3D model from some of the photogrammetry that she's been doing there. And this scene here, this is actually not a photogrammetry model from the Philippines. It's in the Caribbean, but I wanted to show this to you because we use this in later scenes. This is from the 100 Island Challenge initiative. These data sets were provided to us by Dr. Stuart Sandin at the Scripps Institution for Oceanography. And marine biologists and photographers around the world are donating their time and swimming these 10 meter by 10 meter plots with a camera underwater and taking up to 5,000 photos of a reef scape, and then creating these incredibly huge three-dimensional data sets of corals, exactly like what Yasmeen is doing, but on a much wider scale. And one thing I wanted to mention too is that we're doing this at the Academy as well. Pim Bumgarts on Tuesday gave a great presentation for an Academy Breakfast Club just 2 days ago, and it talks about the work he's doing at his Reefscape Genomics Lab. And it's getting, the camera rig and the method of photographing underwater is getting very sophisticated. I highly recommend you watch that tutorial as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
In addition, to add more detail to this, back to the Philippines, to add more detail, we also started growing corals in Houdini. Our brilliant technical director, Matt Blackwell, started playing around with algorithms to grow them in Houdini. Houdini is perfect for doing this type of thing. And this allowed us to add some more soft corals and more intricate corals that could not be built using photogrammetry. And then we also started animating soft corals, because soft corals cannot be modeled using photogrammetry because they're constantly moving. This yellow guy here is actually not a coral, it's a crinoid, but it looked really cool, so I put it in here. And that's also animated in Houdini. And then finally, all of these corals come together. Like I said earlier in the show, we used the software Clarice that was introduced to us by our friends at Tippett Studio, because it allows us to populate a scene with thousands to hundreds of thousands of corals, and it doesn't crash a computer. And you can also light it with physically accurate lighting and rendering and materials and rendering. Okay, now I wanted to show you this another scene that we that's in the show that takes place in the same location. Christina, you can hit play.
This Philippine reef includes many species of living coral. Delicate soft corals are more common, but it's mostly the hard corals that construct reefs. And they've been doing that job for more than 100 million years. To understand how corals build reefs, we need to see how they live. Each coral is actually made up of a colony of tiny animals called coral polyps. And like all animals, they eat.
Okay, now the best part of the show, Ken Ackermann. Take it away.
All right. Okay, thank you, Mike. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other animals in the show besides the corals, the fish and the rest. So I've had the pleasure over the years of animating a number of creatures at the Academy of Sciences, some of which you can see right now, and they've been for our planetarium shows and also for some of our exhibits, and for different videos that we put out on the web. So I'm a big creature guy. I love animating creatures, and I do a little bit of modeling, but I usually build the animation rig, and then I'll do the animation as well. So can you go to the next slide, please, Mike? So these are some of the new cast for Expedition Reef. In the middle is the nudibranch, which we ended up taking this model and turning it into a Snapchat lens, which is really fun. You can like use your phone and you can place it using augmented reality on your desk and all this stuff. And we had a blast playing around with that. And we made a number of those lenses. Maybe we can put a link in the chat. But anyways, so yeah, you can see on the bottom left, that's the moray eel, and you can kind of see the animation rig. So the way that it works is you build a 3D model, and then you put in a skeleton and a bunch of controls that you can then manipulate to pose it in different ways over time. And you can actually see that on the turtle on the right too. You can see some of his animation controls, those little wires around his head that looks like a football helmet. Those are the controls that I would animate to bring it to life. Can you go to the next slide? So those were some of the animals that we got up close to, but then we were going to have a ton of fish, obviously. And this, what you're looking at right here, this is actually from another production we did, I think it was back in 2014, called Habitat Earth. And I built this interesting rig, fish rig, that involved a lot of manual effort to animate it. And it was cool, and I was very proud of it at the time. But I realized that for the scale of what we were doing for Expedition Reef, I had to kind of rethink things. And this was going to be, to put this many fish into a scene was going to become a logistical nightmare. And so we had to think of a different way to do it. Can you go to the next slide, Mike? So this is a look at some of the cast of characters that you'll see in Expedition Reef. And I think in the end, we had 30 different species of fish that we worked with. And we worked very closely with, we worked very closely with the scientists at the Academy, Bart Shepard especially, and Luis Rocha, to help us identify what types of fish would be in the locations we were going to, how they would school, like how many of them would be in a group. I learned that some of them would be loners and others would be in a large school, and their kind of general behavior. So, but what we ended up doing was, since we had such a large number of them to animate, we used our software Houdini. If you could go to the next slide, Mike. Houdini had this really cool package for animating crowds, and so what it allowed us to do was sort of create different behaviors that I could then, send out a bunch of fish, and they would all either swim together in a certain way, or they would wander randomly, or they would seek food. So anyways, using the crowd simulation software, I could build these different behaviors, and then I could take all the different fish that you saw on the previous slide and assign them, their behavior, and then set them free in the scene, essentially. And we had a feeling that because the coral scenes that you were going to see were going to be so incredibly rich with visual stimulus, that if we got the fish kind of the macro movement of the fish pretty well nailed, that it would look real. And so I didn't spend too much time like worrying about individual fishes. I just tried to get like the overall feel of these schools of fish. We did also build a more complex hero fish, we called it, where that way, if we wanted it to swim close to the camera and do something interesting, we could do that. You mind going to the next slide?
Yeah,
okay, so this is one of the joke I always say is that, the one thing I really want to do at the Academy is animate a dinosaur, but this was the next best thing, I guess you could say. They told me that we wanted to have the scene where a crown of thorns starfish, which is this starfish that eats corals, and it can be incredibly invasive, and it can actually do a lot of damage to a reef because it doesn't have a lot of natural predators, and all those little spikes on it are kind of venomous, and so they're very kind of nasty little creatures. And while we were researching them, we found this video of this little tiny crab that was living inside a coral, and the crown of thorns starfish came up, and the crab went out there and started, fighting at him and trying to get him to go away. So, and in that opening scene, we were trying to show different relationships that you might encounter on a reef, and some of them were nice symbiotic relationships, and others were not so nice. So, anyways, my task here was to animate a battle between these two. So, I guess you could play the reel, please, Mike. And I'll talk a little bit about, there's kind of an interesting software issue here, but I'll talk about that after.
You didn't have any fun with this at all.
Come on, crab.
Okay.
Yay, crab.
Yeah, you get the idea. Yeah, so that's a little bit about the creatures in the show. I think up next, Mike, we have that shot.
Here's the breakdown.
Okay, yeah. So this is kind of a look of, we're developing, this scene in particular took a long time to develop. So what you're seeing here is various renders over time, and you can see kind of the change as things improve, as all the different people who are working on this kind of made progress on their different aspects of the scene. And anyways, I put this together for a presentation. I thought it was just kind of cool to check out, because you can kind of see the progression of the shot in a sense. Like if you look right here, you'll see a very early bad model of the eel that we just put in there to sort of figure things out. And then a modeler that we worked with, Dave Wolf, made this really beautiful eel model. And then we got that in there. And so you can kind of see how things come together when all these different people are working, and then they put all their stuff together. It's really fun to see. But I wanted to mention, I think Dwayne had asked earlier about the software and about his students in his after-school program being able to use it. And I just wanted to say, some of the software we used, like Blender, for instance, is a completely free open source program that anybody can download and use, and you can do anything in there. You can build a whole 3D world in there. It's a really cool piece of software. And then some of the ones that the other one that we used a lot, Houdini, you do have to pay for that, but you can download I think it's called the Apprentice version. And so anybody can download that and essentially use the whole program and learn the program for free. And then the only limitation is the final renders that they output are watermarked or something like that. So if somebody really wanted to learn that, they can download it and just go to town checking it out. So
yeah.
Great point.
And actually, on that note, this next scene that we're going to watch, which takes place in Curacao in the Caribbean, was all rendered in Blender with free software. Some of the initial modeling was done in Houdini, but most of it, everything was brought together in Blender. So do you want to say anything else about it, Ken?
I just wanted to, there's kind of a question that's come up a few times that I think is worth addressing, but it may be a little longer. And that's about why we decided to do this is in computer graphics versus filming this.
Yeah.
And it's actually, there's several reasons for that. Part of it is the general aesthetic of the films that we make. So a lot of times we're using the planetarium to take people on these journeys to different places that you can't go, whether it's far out in space or far out into outer space, or down to a tiny microscopic riding along the edge of a coral and seeing it eat a copepod. And these are places that a camera just can't go, and you certainly can't do it continuously the way that we do. And the other thing is there's a lot of technical challenges to doing a shot like this at the resolution that we need for our planetarium. It's a very high resolution image that needs to be filmed in a certain way. And so ultimately, doing it using computer graphics gives us a very large amount of artistic control over what we can do and aesthetically how we can put the show together. And also, I mean, everybody on our team are CG artists, so we love a good challenge like this. And this was probably the biggest challenge that many of us have bit off in a long time. So it was fun to do.
Cool. So we just have 2 more scenes to show you, and then we're going to be close to wrapping up. Maybe we can answer a few more questions, and then we'll be done. All right, let's watch the next scene.
Let's visit Curaçao's fringing reef, where we can witness these effects firsthand, and also learn what scientists are doing to help ensure reef's survival. Shallow reefs are particularly sensitive to increasing temperatures. Warming water can cause coral bleaching when an entire colony of coral polyps loses its color. Let's visit an individual polyp to see how this happens. Too much light or heat causes the coral's algae to release chemicals that damage the host. The stressed coral expel their algae, sacrificing their primary energy source in doing so. Much like an overreactive immune system. Because corals lose their natural color when they lose their algae, we call this coral bleaching. Bleached corals are sick, but not dead. Algae can recolonize bleached corals if conditions improve quickly enough. So bleached reefs can recover.
Oof. That was a real tug on the heartstrings.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, somebody asked about this, what our upcoming projects were. So here we have it. The Big Astronomy on the left is a show that is actually done. We finished it a few months ago, and that was a production that was part of a grant from the National Science Foundation about astronomy in Chile. And that one we actually did shoot a lot of live action footage. And I think that was something that it was new to our team. And there was a lot of discovery in the process. And I think it was safer to discover that on dry land in a controlled environment versus underwater in a coral reef. But we learned a ton of interesting techniques, and I think we're going to continue to shoot stuff on our films moving forward. And we're also definitely going to continue doing a lot of stuff using computer graphics as well. And then Living Worlds is the show that we're currently working on. Do you want to say something about that, Mike?
Sure. So it's about the coevolution of life and the planet Earth and how the two have evolved together, and also how that informs the way we search for life on other exoplanets, how we're search for life in the Milky Way galaxy. So there'll be scenes that take place on Earth, but also in other parts of the solar system, and then we'll visit other exoplanets that are being discovered and talk about how all of that informs how we can improve life on this planet. And that comes out in February. Hopefully we'll get it done on time. But the Big Astronomy is in 2 languages. It's in English and Spanish, and it will be distributed around the world for free because it's NSF grant. So hopefully all of you get a chance to see it. I mean, hopefully you get a chance to come to Orson Planetarium soon, along with all of us, so that we can sit in there together and watch shows there, which is much more fun than watching it on our computers.
Yeah. And so, somebody asked about VR experiences, if we've done that with any of our content before, which we have.
Our prior show, before Expedition Reef, we created a show called Incoming, which is about the formation of the solar system, the history of the solar system, about comets and asteroids. And that show, when we finished the planetarium version of it, we did a full 360 video in stereo version of it to watch on VR goggles. There are pieces of it on YouTube at the moment that you can watch, but we haven't licensed it, or we haven't distributed it yet for people to watch on headsets. It's a bit tricky to do that. So, but we'll continue to do it. And we do use VR headsets to proof our work and also to share our work with other people around the world, especially our musician and our sound designer. We don't see that often. They just work in their sound studios, and sometimes they look at the footage on a VR headset to get a better sense of the space. So I think we're up to an hour and 10 minutes almost here. Why don't we have one last scene we'd like to show you, but I think after that we'll just finish up. Any last things you guys want to say?
Thanks everybody for tuning in. And there's one other question about the size of our team that I saw. And when we were working on Expedition Reef, it's, I don't know, maybe there's like somewhere between 10 and to 15 of us that really are putting in the direct work on the show. And then we have a huge amount of contributors who help either with research or people like Yasmeen, who are off making these amazing models and then letting us use them in the show. But in terms of the actual like rendering and building of the CG scenes, there's about a dozen of us or so who are doing all that work.
And walking through all this again makes me really miss scuba diving and being in the Philippines. So thanks to the Academy for doing this, for the opportunity to reminisce, you know, get out of my house virtually.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Yeah.
All right, Christina, you can play the last scene. Goodbye, everybody.
To reproduce, corals release their genetic material into the surrounding water, typically at night. Because corals can't mingle to mate, they let the ocean currents do the matchmaking. A spawning event can occur at the same time among many species along a reef. Corals sense changes in daylight and water temperature, even the light of the full moon. These cue the corals to release bundles of sperm and eggs that float upward, drifting with the current. Fertilized eggs will develop into free-swimming larvae, which eventually settle onto a suitable surface and grow into polyps.
Oh, one last thing I wanted to ask everyone. Did anyone figure out who the narrator is? If you're still with us, throw it in the comments.
I think I saw somebody said it earlier, I believe.
Oh, really? So the narrator is, let's see. Well, the narrator is Lea Salonga. She's a famous singer who is the singing voice for the Disney films, I think, Mulan, and for Jasmine, right? Is that right? Yeah, she's excellent.
She was born in the Philippines.
Born in the Philippines.
Comes full circle.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your evening.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.